So when Ambassador Morgenthau became aware of executions of Armenian leaders in city squares and the wholesale purging of Armenian communities and massacres of them as they were sent out into the desert, he appealed to Washington for guidance, permission really, to denounce these crimes. He was denied that permission and told by his betters that internal affairs were not his business. And I mean, he is a person, Ambassador Morgenthau was a person who had Christian missionaries turning up in his residence and at his office with tears streaming down their faces describing what they had just witnessed. And he didn't feel that it was about diplomacy. He felt like it was about humanity and made it very clear that what he was seeing and what he was learning from demanded an amendment to the ways of doing business normally, that somehow he wouldn't have called it genocide at the time because the word didn't exist at that point, but that these crimes against humanity demanded a very different kind of interaction with the host government. But he was seen as a troublemaker in Washington, and he was eventually recalled and actually had trouble finding good work in Washington again because he was seen to be a loose cannon of sorts who let his values get in the way of sound traditional judgment.
But Dr. Powers, if we can just take a moment and go back to 1915, Wilson did not only choose to not intervene, but he had also opposed the Entente Britain, France, Russia's proposal to try Talat and Enver Pasha. Were there any other clandestine reasons for his adamant defiance?
In the wake of the war and in the wake of the genocide, the United States was looking to build a new relationship with the post-war Turkey, and Turkish nationalism, which initially seemed willing to tolerate prosecution and accountability as a way of also setting the record straight and freeing itself of any collective guilt, changed its mind and began to see this as a Western imperialistic intrusion on their internal affairs. And as soon as the Turks changed their mind on what they wanted to do, the British and the Americans went along with it and basically agreed to sweep the atrocities under the rug.
Bring up something very interesting in your book where you talk about how American policymakers try to avoid conflict which threaten American interests, yet they still need to appear morally just. They justify their inaction by basically overemphasizing the ambiguity of the facts. Is this what's happening in the case of the Armenian Genocide? Are we basically just saying, well, the evidence isn't quite 100% factual, so that's the reason why we're not recognizing it as a genocide?
You know, you hear that less and less. You hear fewer and fewer fact-based justifications for denial. I mean, I think what was interesting about the abortive effort to get the resolution passed is that members of Congress, et cetera, who opposed the resolution, in my impression was that they were actually quite straightforward, that this was all about Turkey and the relationship today, all about Iraq, and they would invoke issues of role, you know, whether it's the job of the president to be a historian or whether it's the job of the legislature to weigh in on events. But you didn't hear very many people with a straight face saying, you know, these massacres weren't carried out, you know, the Turks didn't march people into the desert and didn't round up Armenian intellectuals. You don't hear as much disputation of the facts as you used to even just 5 or 10 years ago. And I think that's a mark of progress in that the facts are more and more established. It was almost like people who opposed the resolution sort of, you know, winked at one another and said, well, we know why we're opposing this. It's just because of today's relationship with Turkey and our dependence on them with regard to the war in Iraq, or our desire to have a secular, you know, relatively moderate Muslim ally, et cetera. I mean, in other words, there was a lot of, you know, kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We all understand why we're doing this. We just need to do it. Part of people who oppose the resolution.
In your opinion, what would it take for us to become a nation which does not tolerate genocide no matter what, regardless of our national interest, regardless of what is going on domestically today? We do have to get to that point where certain things are just intolerable.
I agree that we have to get to that point, but I don't think we should ever disregard our national interest in the sense that, of course, American national security is going to be the prerogative of and the priority of any American president. You know, it's principally why he or she is commander-in-chief. So I don't think one has to disregard it. I just think one has to think more holistically and with a longer time frame about what actually advances the national interest in a globalized world. And in this regard, those who said it's not in America's national interest to recognize the Armenian Genocide, and that it would render, U.S. forces more vulnerable, or, that there'd be an economic cutoff of some kind. And I think one just has to look at the example of France, see how quickly ties were restored in the wake of parliamentary recognition. One has to understand that the relationship with Turkey will be guided by a whole range of concerns, some of which are economic, some of which are historical or moral or reputational, like this one, and some of which are national security or European Union related. I mean, that is, there are a lot of issues in the bundle ties between Turkey and the United States, and so I don't think you can scrap national interest. I just think you have to think about the degree to which imagine yourself secure and respected in the long term, if there are these anomalies, if there are, these friendships that lead you to distort the fact. The important recognition that has to occur on the part of American leaders is that our ideals and our national security are linked in the long term. They may not seem linked tomorrow when it comes to the question of Armenian genocide recognition, but over time, getting an issue of a historical truth even out of the way, just recognizing it once and for all so it no longer plagues the relationship, that it is established as a historical truth in the same way that the Holocaust has long been established, and, relationships between Armenians and Turks, Armenians and Americans, Turks and Americans will actually, I think, over time, benefit from actually calling a spade and telling history like it is. In terms of the larger question of how genocide is made intolerable, it's really probably going to come from domestic political pressure. There's now an anti-genocide constituency in this country. There are 500 college campuses that have on them genocide, anti-genocide chapters. 500 high schools have those chapters, students taking action to end genocide, they're called. And you have a 1-800-genocide number in this country, which sounds kind of dreadful, but is in fact a good way for anyone to plug in their zip code and get connected directly to their member of Congress or their senator. You now have, for the first time, never again becoming political. And this movement and the kind of citizen action that fuels it forces politicians to think more carefully about their domestic political interests as well as their perceptions of national interest as defined by the executive branch. So I think we've actually made a lot of progress in terms of the political pressure.
And what action can our listeners take, maybe on a grassroots level, to assure that the first genocide of the century finally has a voice and is recognized despite our national interests?
I think Armenians and Armenian Americans have done the most important thing that they could do over the last few decades, and that is they have built up a store of irrefutable historical knowledge on the crimes committed in 1915, on the massacres. They have worked to ensure that American textbooks include case studies of the Armenian Genocide. They've worked to ensure people who care a great deal about the Holocaust understand the role that the Armenian Genocide played in making Hitler feel like he could get away with the extermination of the Jews. They have worked to embed the Armenian Genocide in culture and in annals of truth. The Armenian Genocide is widely seen in the United States as a fact and not as a matter of historical controversy. In terms of what is left to be achieved, many, many more people can be educated about what happened. We need to continue to move in the direction where if someone speaks up at a bookstore or at a college campus and says the Armenian Genocide never happened, or sure there were killings, but it was civil war, that person sounds as absurd to the people in the room as a Holocaust denier sounds absurd and hateful. So I think there's a lot that can be done in the realm of culture and in the realm of promotion of the history so that it is not just known in Armenian circles or in certain pockets of America that happen to be the focus of education efforts or commemoration efforts. Then it'll just become harder and harder, I think, for an American president or members of Congress to stand just the sheer weight of the historical fact.
Thank you so much for your time today. Dr. Power is a professor of practice of global leadership and public policy at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government.
Thank you.